violent crimes with a focus on homicide. About 2% of Americans will be victims of a violent crime each year. Violent crimes may include attempted as well as completed crimes, such as attempted rape, and crimes in which only the threat of force or violence or some other form of coercion was used to gain compliance. This is for all violent crimes. Homicide, the most serious, is also, thankfully, among the rarest. In the United States, less than 5 people per 100,000 in the population will be murdered in a given year, which means your personal odds of getting murdered are less than 1 in 20,000. One second piece of good news is this. The overall crime rate in the United States, for both property and violent crimes, has been falling steadily since 1996, as shown here in this graph. Let's look at homicide and the demography of victims. If you watch U.S. media, whether news or fictional/entertainment media, like crime shows, you may have gotten the impression that the majority of murder victims in the United States are white and female. Those tend to be the victim stories that get the most coverage and attention. But in fact, men are far more likely to be victims of homicide than women, at about 77.7% of victims, compared to about 22.1% in a study released by the FBI in 2013. Blacks are also more likely to be victims of murder than Caucasian whites, despite their lower share of the population. Finally, when we look at age data, we see that the risk of falling victim to homicide is higher among young adult populations. Young adults are also more likely to commit most kinds of crimes and are at a higher risk of perpetrating homicide themselves. When they do, they tend to target other young adults, mostly friends, acquaintances, or romantic partners. Romantic partner homicides are one of the few categories of homicide where women are at a higher victimization risk than men. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, about 64% of victims of intimate partner killings every year are women. Fictional crime stories also often focus on homicides where the perpetrator is a random stranger. But according to the FBI, most murder victims are actually killed by someone they know. In a 2010 study of homicide victims, where the relationship between the killer and the victim is known, 38% were perpetrated by acquaintances, 18% by a romantic or intimate partner, 15% by a family member, and 5% by someone surviving loved ones categorized as a friend. Only 22% of murder victims are killed by a stranger. Most murders are also intraracial, meaning people tend to be killed by members of their own racial or ethnic group. Whites kill other whites, blacks other blacks, and so on. Even though the majority of murder victims annually are male and non-white, violent crimes which involve white women or girls tend to get the most media attention. This has inspired some media critics to coin the expression missing or murdered white girl syndrome, a sarcastic term used to refer to the fact that white female victim cases also tend to get more media attention than those involving men of any race and those involving non-whites. For example, something like 42% of missing children in the United States are black, but most people are hard-pressed to name a high-profile missing child case featuring either a black boy or black girl, though most of us know names like John Benet Ramsey, Kaylee Anthony, and Elizabeth Smart. Let's talk about method and other contributing factors. Firearms are the most common murder weapon used in American homicides. Of total homicides in 2014, according to the FBI, firearms were the murder weapon in about 68% of cases. Of those, handguns were the specific weapon in about 68.4% of cases. Knives and stabbing, in only 13% of cases, came in a distant second. America's total homicide rate is significantly higher than those of other peer nations, though when compared to poor or developing nations, those with less stable governments, it's better. Mexico's homicide rate is about 4 times ours. Honduras, with one of the highest murder rates in the world, due in large part to severe and widespread gang violence, is about 10 times higher than the US's. So, in the developed world, among peer nations, our murder rate is unusually high, shown here in this chart, though it is still below the global average. Many social scientists believe that America's relatively easy access to guns is one factor that helps to explain why our homicide rates are so much higher than countries like Canada or the UK, which have similar economies, governmental structures, and cultures to our own. Relatively easy access to deadly weapons isn't the only aggravating factor, of course. Alcohol is implicated as a factor in about 40% of all violent crimes, more than any other recreational drug, including illicit drugs like cocaine or crack cocaine. Most homicides involve one victim and one offender. Murders with one or more offenders and multiple victims are rare. Less than 4% of murders involve 2 victims, less than 1% involve 3 or more. However, multiple victim homicides, including serial murders or murder carried out by mass murderers or mass shooters or foreign or domestic terror groups, do receive a disproportionate amount of media attention. Mass shootings, like the Las Vegas mass shooting of 2017, some of the victims of which are shown here, as a subset of homicide, have become a significant social problem in the United States, in part because they appear to be becoming both more common and more deadly. The remainder of this lecture will focus on this phenomenon in particular in more detail. Mass shootings are a subset of what the FBI defines as mass murder. Mass murder is defined as a number of murders, usually 4 or more, simultaneously or over a short time with no substantive cooling off period, and in relatively close geographic proximity. This is distinct from serial murder, which also involves multiple victims, but usually over a longer period of time and with a so-called cooling off period in between. Mass murder may be committed by individuals or organizations. For example, a religious group, a terrorist cell, or a government can all perpetrate mass murder. When a government commits mass murder, we often term this a democide, or a genocide if it targets a particular racial, cultural, or religious community. When carried out by individuals, mass murder often ends in perpetrator suicide, what is sometimes called suicide by cop often, a situation in which an individual behaves in a manner intended to provoke deadly force by law enforcement officers. This is another factor that tends to separate it from serial murder, wherein the perpetrator may target and kill victims for years with no intention of being caught. Mass shootings are a subset of mass murder that involve situations where the murder weapon was one or more firearms. The math and definition of mass shootings remains controversial. Law enforcement usually define a mass shooting as an incident in which 4 or more people are killed or injured by gunfire. But media tend to be more likely to call something a mass shooting if it is partially public versus familial, not gang-related, and if it did not begin as part of another crime. So, for example, as an outgrowth of a bank robbery. Like I said, this is controversial. The practice of ignoring gang-related shootings, even when multiple people are killed or wounded, for example, may suggest a tendency to pay more attention to crimes when they involve certain groups of people, i.e., suburban high school students in a movie theater, versus victims of gang shootings, even though many victims of gang shootings are themselves innocent bystanders. There is also a controversy over how victim counts are calculated, specifically over whether the shooter should be counted in the death toll, since he, or sometimes she, often does end up dead at the end of his or her rampage. Some victim counts do include the shooter or shooters, some don't. So coverage of the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando, Florida, for example, sometimes lists the death toll at 50 and sometimes at 49, depending on whether the gunman himself is counted among the dead. One of the most notorious mass shootings in modern U.S. history, though it is no longer even among the top 10 deadliest, nor is it even the deadliest school shooting, was the Columbine High School mass shooting of April 20th, 1999, wherein offenders murdered 12 fellow students and one teacher, injuring 24 others, before committing suicide. The Columbine shooting was tragic and riveted the attention of the entire world for months after it happened, but it could have been far worse. Originally, the perpetrators had planned the attack to be primarily a mass bombing. They had constructed a large number of homemade bombs, including 2 potentially very powerful bombs wired to 20-pound propane tanks, which they left in bags throughout the school's cafeteria and in their own cars in the school's parking lot. Their plan was to trigger the bombs via timers in the cafeteria during the school's crowded lunch shift. Had this plan succeeded, it is estimated their explosives may have generated enough force to collapse the roof of the cafeteria, causing the floor of the crowded library above to crumple into the lunchroom below. That might have led to the deaths of hundreds of people. The shooters took up position in the parking lot with a number of loaded guns, planning to shoot students attempting to escape the explosions, but the bombs failed to detonate. So after waiting a while, the perpetrators changed their plan and entered the school, opening fire on people inside in various parts of the building, before finally turning their weapons on themselves. Bombs packed into their cars in the parking lot were timed to explode later, when they might have killed both first responders, like police and EMS, and also students and teachers seeking shelter. But these also failed to detonate. Columbine changed the experience of attending school for every generation of students that followed it. It also brought changes to law enforcement. Before Columbine, standard police protocol in a school attack assumed a hostage standoff situation, which called for police to surround the building, set up a perimeter, contain the damage, and try to make contact with the offenders inside. Since Columbine, that approach has been replaced by a tactic called immediate action rapid deployment that takes into account the presence of an active shooter whose interest is to kill, not to take hostages. It calls for quick entry and advancement toward the sound of gunfire, without even stopping to aid victims, by whichever officer arrives on the scene first. This strategy is meant to minimize civilian casualties, but significantly elevates the risk for police. At the time of this recording, there have been 152 mass shootings in the United States since 1966, resulting in 1,091 deaths, an average of about 7 victims per event. Don't rely on that figure too much, though. Sadly, it is likely to become outdated very fast. If mass shooting is defined more broadly, as any incident in which 4 or more people are shot in one event, we've seen nearly 1 mass shooting per day in the United States since 2013. The U.S. has the highest total and per capita incidence of mass shootings in the developed world, not including countries currently at war or in states of civil war. Unfortunately, mass shootings also seem to be becoming both more common and more deadly in the United States, as shown in this chart of mass shootings, both by victims injured and by victim fatalities, from 1966 to 2015. The Washington Post newspaper maintains an active, frequently updated database of U.S. mass shootings since 1966. All but 3 of the 155 shooters were male, most between the ages of 20 and 49 years of age. The majority were white, but so is the majority of the U.S. population. In fact, racial characteristics of mass shooters tend to comport with the percentage of each group in the general population. No one group seems to show elevated risk of becoming perpetrators, in other words. Shooters often carry multiple firearms to their planned rampages. Of those guns whose origin we know, about 78% were obtained legally, so not through criminal networks or the black market. What drives this kind of behavior? Let's look at individual or micro-level factors. Certainly, many mass murderers or serial killers show some evidence of what the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, defines as antisocial personality disorder, and what the average person may refer to as sociopathy or psychopathy. Some people make a distinction between a sociopath and a psychopath, others don't, but the preferred clinical term is usually antisocial personality disorder. For diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder, the individual has to have a history of a range of behaviors or characteristics since about age 15, including behaviors or characteristics like failure to conform to social norms, a history of lying, deceit, or manipulation, a history of impulsivity, aggression, or violence, difficulty sustaining relationships, a reckless disregard for the safety of others, and a lack of empathy or remorse. By the way, that list should not be used to diagnose roommates or ex-boyfriends or girlfriends, no matter how tempting. It's estimated by many clinicians that about 1% of the population may fit clinical criteria for antisocial personality disorder, although this is thought to be somewhat higher among incarcerated populations. Other social scientists and criminologists focus less on antisocial personality disorder as a diagnosis and talk about something variously called the dark triad, or more recently, the dark tetrad. I use psychologist Martha Trout's definition of the dark triad, which involves a constellation of 3 factors or behaviors. The first is narcissism, which describes an inflated or grandiose self-image. Narcissism comes to us from the Greek myth of Narcissus, a youth who was so impressed with his own beauty that he gazed at a reflection of himself in a pool until he starved to death and turned into a little white flower we call the narcissus. The modern-day equivalent of that might be the person who constantly takes and posts pictures of themselves on social media, but narcissism is more serious than that. The narcissist thinks he's a genius and a god, the most important person in the room, the most important person in the world. Nobody else matters but for what they can give him: sex, money, attention, or praise. Machiavellianism is the second characteristic. It comes from a 16th century political treatise written by Italian political theorist Niccolo Machiavelli. To make a very long story short, essentially, Machiavelli argued that a prince or monarch needed to do whatever he had to do to stay in power and achieve glory, even if it was immoral and meant hurting people. So Machiavellianism is a willingness to subvert morality or the rights of others to achieve personal goals. Finally, number 3 is a lack of empathy. People who have difficulty feeling empathy may have a hard time understanding the emotional states of others or putting themselves in the shoes of other people. They can't really sustain real intimacy, have a difficult time feeling love or a real connection to people or anything else. This kind of person might, for example, spend a lot of money buying a purebred dog because they see it as a status object, but they can't really form an emotional connection with it, and so when the responsibility of caring for it gets boring, they'll dump it along the side of the road and not feel particularly bad about that either. Some psychologists argue for adding a 4th characteristic, turning the dark triad into a dark tetrad. This characteristic is sadism, which describes taking enjoyment from the pain or fear of others. This 4th personality feature might be what sets your everyday jerk apart from someone really dangerous. Columbine shooter Eric Harris played peekaboo with some of his victims before killing them, taking enjoyment from taunting them and watching their fear. Dennis Rader, shown here, who killed 10 people in Wichita, Kansas between the years of 1974 and 1991, took to taunting the press in letters in which he referred to himself as the BTK killer. He said that stood for bind, torture, and kill. That's sadism, taking real delight in causing fear or pain. We fear the sociopath, but oddly, as a culture, we also tend to glorify them. The sociopath is both a kind of modern-day folk devil and an anti-hero. He or she is usually portrayed as a monster from birth, an amoral predator who looks human but essentially isn't. But at the same time, many of our best known, and in an odd way, most beloved cultural figures are serial killers, both real, like Ted Bundy, and fictional, like Hannibal Lecter or Dexter Morgan. Similarly, the same traits we associate with antisocial personality disorder, a disdain for rules, a willingness to do anything to succeed, excessive overconfidence, a ruthlessness that causes the individual to discount harm done to others so long as he or she comes out on top, are traits we value as a culture. In a success is everything society, we often teach children that it doesn't matter how you win, so long as you do. For this reason, some psychologists argue that the US has a higher proportion of sociopaths than more collectivist cultures, like those found in Japan, for example, or that sociopathy itself may manifest differently here, in more antisocial ways, although these things can be difficult to prove. Because mass murder is such a heavily male phenomenon, and mass shootings are such a disproportionately American one, some experts, like psychologist Peter Langman, who studies mass and school shooters, argue that cultural notions of normative masculinity may also play a part. Because, of course, women can be very aggressive. We can kill and do, although our victims are more likely to be our own children, domestic partners, or other family members. And a weapon erases strength differences between women and men. So, why are relatively few women mass shooters? Peter Langman argues that surviving writings of many mass shooters provide evidence of something he calls damaged masculinity, which is similar to what sociologists usually call toxic masculinity, wherein the offender combines a sense of personal failure or powerlessness with a belief that hurting and dominating others will allow him to be respected, powerful, and strong. This quote at the left is from Elliot Rodger, a mass shooter who killed 6 people near the UC Santa Barbara campus in 2014. He wrote, "I compared myself to other teenagers and became very angry that they were able to experience all the things I desired. I never had my first kiss. I never held hands with a girl. I never lost my virginity. After I picked up the handgun, I brought it back to my room with a new sense of power. I was now armed. Who's the alpha male now? Bitches." This is most definitely not an argument that mass shooters do what they do because bad things happen to them, or they are rejected by women, or mistreated, or oppressed, or even bullied. In most cases, that isn't true. Many come from privileged backgrounds. Both Columbine shooters came from good, loving, financially well-off families with involved and affectionate parents. They did well in school. One, Dylan Klebold, had just gotten into and visited the campus of his first-choice college a few weeks before the shooting. Both were reasonably popular. Rumors that the boys had been bullied ultimately turned out to be false, although there was a history of both of them bullying other people. Both had experienced dating girls and having girlfriends. But both certainly fantasized extensively about hurting people they felt failed to adequately respect them, which is probably more evidence of an outsized sense of entitlement rather than any real strain or deprivation. Serial killings and mass shootings are different phenomena, although there can be some overlap in offender personality parameters. One distinction between the two is that mass shooters are more likely to be driven by suicidal impulses than most known serial killers. This is one reason why bringing some of the things that we know about suicide can help to shed some light on the mass shooter phenomenon too. Suicide contagion refers to the fact that direct or indirect exposure to suicide, especially well-publicized or celebrity suicide, generally leads to a subsequent increase in suicide among others. Mass shootings seem to have the same effect. They come in clusters, and one well-publicized mass shooting will generally encourage more. The mass shooter, then, may combine a couple of separate characteristics: a belief in the tenets of toxic masculinity, personality traits like narcissism, sadism, and a lack of empathy, and finally, suicidality, a desire to die. When you combine all of that, you can get someone who decides he will spend his last hours on Earth destroying as many other lives as possible. Researchers who study mass shootings talk about something like suicide contagion that is now called the Columbine Effect, meaning well-publicized mass shootings seem to lead to a spike in incidences of similar crimes or attempted crimes. Columbine itself is noteworthy in the fact that in many of the attempted or actualized shootings that followed it, perpetrators seem to have been obsessed with it, talking about it frequently or leaving references to it in writings they left behind. In at least 3 cases that we know of, rampage killers are known to have made pilgrimages to Littleton, Colorado, to visit the site of the massacre before carrying out their own attacks. By the way, this photo isn't of any of those young men. It isn't even one of a direct victim of a mass shooting. It depicts one of the millions of indirect victims of mass shootings in our culture. In 2016, a Michigan mom snapped a photo of what she thought was her 3-year-old daughter being mischievous while standing on top of the toilet in their house, only to later realize that the little girl was practicing a school shooting drill she'd learned at her preschool. The little girl told her mom they'd been taught how to hide in their classrooms, but also how to hide in the bathroom during an invasion or lockdown drill. The children were told to hide by climbing on top of the toilet so the stall would look unoccupied to an armed person entering the bathroom, and to stay very, very quiet. This photo went viral on the internet because of the simple, powerful way it portrays the danger and sense of fear now felt by even the youngest American children. It can be hard to know how to prevent mass murder, but some experts do issue guidelines for media and also social media coverage of mass shootings. These are meant to discourage future copycat actions by depriving mass shooters of something a lot of them seem to want: fame. Mass shooters often express a strong desire to be remembered or glorified for their acts. Omar Mateen, the Pulse nightclub shooter, spent a great deal of time during his rampage, before he was ultimately shot by the police, hunkered down, checking Facebook and social media and online news on his cell phone so he could enjoy his own coverage. What these men, and in some cases women, are trying to do is create an image of themselves that will live on in the public mind as someone who is dominant, violent, threatening, and strong. They want posthumous fame. They want to be remembered as outlaws. Yes, they'll be hated, but that's okay. They won't be nobodies. In their mind, being remembered as a monster is still better than not being remembered at all. So the goal with media coverage is to strip as much of that glory or notoriety out of the headlines as possible, to avoid creating legacy tokens, images, or words that immortalize the shooter or his grievances. It is important to try to understand the motivations of perpetrators, but it is also important to remember who the real victims are. Both those who die and are injured in attacks like these, and those who lose loved ones, as well as all of the generations of children who grow up in fear, wondering if their classroom will be next. This photo, also recently gone viral, was taken by a primary school teacher and depicts a nursery rhyme now being used in some kindergarten classrooms to remind students how to behave during a real lockdown or a lockdown drill. It reads, "Lockdown, lockdown, shut the door. Shut the lights off, say no more. Go behind the desk and hide. Wait until it's safe inside. Lockdown, lockdown, it's all done. Now it's time to have some fun." These are 4 suggestions given to journalists to minimize the amount of fame or notoriety their coverage will give to mass shooters. Media, for example, are advised to report on the perpetrator forensically or dispassionately, to avoid terms like lone wolf or even school shooter, which may glorify the offender and carry a cachet with certain kinds of young men or women. Instead, they are advised to use terms like offender or passive voice constructions, which shift focus from the individual to the act, for example, referring to them as a person who committed an act of mass murder. Journalists are also advised to minimize the use of perpetrator name and photo, and to keep the perpetrator's name out of the headlines. Make it so that he or she is more quickly forgotten. Third, journalists are advised to avoid using pseudo-commando or other posed photos of the perpetrator. Many shooters, in the lead up to their crimes, will take selfie photos or videos of themselves, tricked out in body armor and tactical gear, scowling at the camera while gripping a handgun or a rifle. These outlaw-typed staged photos were often used by media in the past, along with scary or threatening images of the shooter taken during the rampages themselves, by security cameras, for example, or victims' cell phones. But that tends to give the shooter what he wants: an immortal image of him as powerful and dominant and in control that will live on after he does. So modern media are now more likely to use neutral or even deliberately unflattering photos of the perpetrator instead. Finally, media are urged to avoid publishing the perpetrator's personal writings or video journals. Don't give him or her a platform to air his or her grievances after the act itself. An additional social factor that inevitably becomes part of the discussion on mass shooting is guns. America has a strong gun culture, in part due to the fact that gun ownership rights are written into the U.S. Constitution. The Supreme Court has determined that the wording of the Second Amendment allows for individual or private gun ownership, although both federal and state laws can and do regulate this to greater or lesser extents. Perhaps for this reason, Americans own more handguns per capita than any other country on Earth, with an estimated 88.8 firearms per 100 people in the population. Other high gun ownership nations are also shown here in order, and this list contains a mix of both relatively high homicide and relatively low homicide countries, which does tell us that total gun ownership rates don't give us the whole story. Compared to other countries, the United States makes buying a gun pretty easy. This varies by state, but in the US, the minimum is passing an instant background check that looks at stuff like criminal convictions or your immigration status, and then you buy your gun. Moreover, approximately 1/3 of American gun owners are estimated to buy guns without any background check at all, because background checks are not required when buying directly from a private seller. This is often called the, quote, gun show loophole, unquote. In most other industrialized countries, purchasing a gun is a multi-stage process that takes months. For example, in Canada, to buy a handgun, rifles are a little different, you must prove that you practice at an approved shooting club or range, or show you are a collector. You must complete a safety course and pass both a written and practical test. That is for all guns, including rifles. Think about what you had to go through to get a driver's license. You have to get 2 character references. List the names of all partners you've lived with for the past 2 years. Romantic partners have to be notified by the police, and in some cases sign the application. What they're looking for here is a history of domestic violence. You have to apply for a permit and wait usually a minimum of 45 days for full processing. Pass a background check that considers your criminal and mental health history. And finally, buy your gun. Before you can take your gun home, though, you must register it with the local police. Now, Canada does still have mass shootings. They have one every year or two. In 2017, there was a white nationalist attack on a mosque in Quebec City that killed 6 people. But a mass shooting every year, gun control proponents point out, is a little different from the US's average of about 1 per day. Again, formal laws don't tell us everything. In some countries like Mexico or Russia, the on-the-books laws are different from daily practice. Mexico has far stricter gun laws than the United States. In Mexico, for example, there's only one store in the whole country, it's in Mexico City, that's allowed to sell guns legally. But in reality, there's a thriving black market for them, many of which are actually smuggled down from the United States, and fairly high unofficial gun ownership rates, as well as a higher murder rate than one finds in the United States. Guns are the most common weapon used in homicides in the United States, but if you own a gun, statistically, the person it is most likely to kill is you. 61% of fatal gunshot wounds in the United States every year are self-inflicted or suicides. 35% are homicides, and about 4% are accidents, shown in the pie chart of all annual gun deaths on the right. Accidental gun deaths are a smallest part of this statistic, but they are often especially tragic because they are more likely to involve young children. In a study done in 2015, 265 U.S. children that year were shown to have shot someone accidentally. 31% of those cases ended in fatalities, and half the time the victim was the shooter him or herself, often a young child or even a toddler who'd picked up the weapon and was playing with it. In a study done by Everytown Research, it was determined that about 70% of those deaths might have been prevented had the guns been properly stored. Proper storage in this case is defined as storing the gun unloaded in a locked safe, not loaded on the coffee table or in mom's purse. In most cases, even when parents think they've done a good job simply hiding their gun from their kids, the kids know where it is. A recent Harvard study found that something like 70% of kids 10 and under knew where their parents kept their guns, and 40% admitted to having handled them, whereas something like 20% of parents in the same study said their children knew where the household gun even was. On the flip side of the equation are what law enforcement calls justifiable homicides. Justifiable homicides are one major rationale for private gun ownership. Advocates argue that individuals have the right to protect themselves and their property with lethal force. Caution, we don't call 911 is a common sign or slogan on products at gun shows, for example. It is true that private ownership of guns can prevent as well as facilitate crime, and there are about 260 documented cases every year where that happens, according to the FBI, meaning there are approximately 260 justifiable firearm homicides by private citizens annually. There are also cases where gun ownership on the part of a victim or bystander may have created a non-lethal deterrence. That basically means a crime that might have committed wasn't committed because the offender simply found out the target was armed. Those are obviously harder to count. That is certainly one thing that private firearm ownership is intended for, but justifiable homicides are the least common form of gun death in the United States. There are still more accidental shootings by children than there are justifiable homicides annually. Over 8,000 criminal gun homicides every year, and almost 3 times as many gun suicides. Gun control advocates argue that society and gun technology have changed significantly since the time of the Founding Fathers, and that legislation needs to reflect that by making private gun ownership more regulated. And it's true. The firearms that our Founding Fathers were familiar with when they wrote the Second Amendment are very different instruments than a modern handgun or rifle. A Revolutionary War-era musket could be fired approximately once every 15 seconds, assuming use by a trained musketman, for about 4 minutes before the barrel became fouled and would need to be cleaned. For a modern semi-auto weapon, that's much faster, at about 45 to 60 rounds per minute. Really, what slows you down with a modern weapon is the reload time. A standard-sized magazine on a police-issued Glock handgun is about 17 rounds, for example. Gun control opponents hold that a, quote, bad guy with a gun can only be stopped by a good guy with a gun, and argue that wider gun ownership or more liberal carry laws will act as a deterrent. As a fairly socially conservative state, Texas lawmakers have pushed option 2, arguing that there need to be more guns in the population to prevent mass shootings rather than fewer. In 2016, Texas enacted campus carry legislation, SB 11, which authorizes concealed carry on college campuses by LTC, licensed to carry holders. The idea that campuses would have students and other individuals who would be armed was something that did raise concern among many faculty, students, and campus administrators. That year, a photograph of a PowerPoint slide from a campus carry training offered to faculty at the University of Houston was posted on the internet and quickly went viral. The slide, offered in a training conducted by the UH Faculty Senate, advised professors to minimize the possibility of potentially violent conflict in classrooms by suggesting they might wish to drop certain topics from the curriculum or tread lightly around sensitive issues. It also suggested that professors take precautions by limiting student contact outside class to scheduled office hours. This was, of course, incredibly controversial because many opponents of campus carry argued it essentially worked as a ban on or a muffling effect on free speech in the classroom. In the wake of the 2018 Santa Fe, Texas high school shooting, wherein 10 people were killed and 13 wounded, the Trump administration has suggested other similar measures to address school shootings, such as arming elementary, middle, and high school teachers. Such proposals have been supported by the NRA, the National Rifle Association, the largest gun owner lobbying group in the United States, but publicly opposed by the American Federation of Teachers and public health groups like the American Medical Association. Majorities of Americans in poll support heavier gun control or regulation that exists now. For example, majorities support closing the so-called gun show loophole that allows sales without background checks from private sellers. But large majorities of survey respondents, 90% in one recent poll, also don't support entirely outlawing the sale and private ownership of firearms. So what do you think? Would you support controls? Yes or no? If so, which ones? Aside from this, are there other measures you think Americans or our lawmakers should take to address mass shootings and other kinds of violent crime? This concludes this lecture. Thank you for listening.